So with this in mind, let me introduce our speaker today and our topic today. George Niland is a spokesperson from the Secretariat of ChargeUp Europe. And as you can see, we will be talking about working for the rollout of electric vehicle charging infrastructure across the EU. ChargeUp Europe is a very good partner to talk about that because they represent the shared interests of 15 members of the EV charging infrastructure industry. And they are operating, as the name says, on a European level. So that's why George will be able to give us some insights into the current legislations and maybe also the expected regulations on the EV charging in the European Union. And so with this very brief introduction, I am happy to give the virtual stage to you, George. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you for inviting us to speak at this. So we're very happy to do so, and we're very happy to have the participants as well join us. So hopefully we can keep you interested over your lunch. It might be sunny or out wherever you are. So hopefully we can keep you engaged throughout this short presentation. We'll keep it short and sweet and to the point, and try and give you an overview essentially of who we are as ChargeUp Europe, what we do and what we stand for. And we'll also give an overview of where we are in terms of the EV market, where we see it going in the next 10 years, where we see a really rapid expansion and mainstreaming, should we say, and why then, because of this, it's such a critical time in terms of policy and legislation at EU level, but also at national level as well. So I'll just bring up my screen now, and maybe you can, is that showing on full screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. So as I said, here's a broad overview of what I'd like to bring you through today. Who we are, where is the market and the ecosystem, and why the policy is so important. Myself, I'm George Niland. I work for ChargeUp Europe in the Secretariat. We're based in Brussels, where we work with our members, basically working on policy and advocacy at that level. So just to dive right in and look at who we are as ChargeUp Europe, we're the Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure Industry Association. So we work essentially to develop and create the conditions for a fast and effortless rollout of EV charging infrastructure in Europe. And we aim to do this by influencing policy and legislation at EU level, but we also look at, of course, at national level where it makes sense as well. So we really want to represent our sector. We didn't have such a voice before, so we felt it was, as you may see or may know yourself with the growth of the market, it's so important for us to have a voice at the table. We started just over a year ago with 3 founding members, a Lego charge point and EV box, and we've grown rapidly since then. From those 3 to, we had 15 a couple of weeks ago. Now we actually have 17. So I think in our view, we reflect the rapid growth of the market as well. And our member companies represent over 300,000 charging points across the EU. We're also growing in terms of, I suppose, how we interact with the ecosystem. We have new categories representing the ecosystem partners, such as ALD Automotive and Elia. So, we're looking at leasing companies, but also transmission system operators, and we expect to add a few more in the coming weeks as well. And I think what's important for us as well is to become a center of expertise or knowledge for the sector. So we team with the EV Roaming Foundation and Arthur D. Little to try and develop studies and data and information that can be useful for policymakers, but also general public as well. So that's our kind of structure. As I said, we're based in Brussels, and we do a lot of advocacy and outreach and awareness raising for the sector. So what are we about? What are we trying to raise awareness about and advocate for? I'll briefly show you our values and goals. We started last year with a set of core foundational values, particularly starting from the driver. We want a consumer-centric market, infrastructure rollout that serves the practical needs of the driver. This is a fast-growing but an increasingly mainstream sector, but the drivers really need to have the system set up that makes it easy for them to drive and charge anywhere across Europe. So what that means is we want to develop and deploy high quality infrastructure that is easy to use for the driver. They have transparency about price. They know where the locations are. You know, if they're driving, where can I charge? What type of charging is it? Is it, we'll say, normal speed charging or faster charging? And we want them to make sure that it's easy for them to we'll say, sign up to a service and charge at any different charging station. We don't want a system where it's complicated for them. So that's kind of our starting point, infrastructure rollout with the driver in the mind. We're looking at an open market model for infrastructure investment. And what this means is we want predictable, harmonized regulation across the EU so that companies can, you know, scale across and develop in different markets. This is also important. It's not just from an industry perspective, but for the development across the EU. We don't want the development of a two-speed Europe where we have, we'll say, a lot of infrastructure in 1 or 2 member states, and then you cross the border as a driver and you can't charge. You as a driver need to be able to know that you can go from A to B, charging where necessary. And we want to make that's the kind of system we want to set up. And we feel that, you know, having an open market that allows and incentivizes investment is the best way to deliver this. Key part of that is open standards and protocols. We don't want to develop, you know, a closed loop ecosystem. So particularly for publicly accessible charging infrastructure, which we'll get into a bit later, it's vital that these are open and can interact and be interoperable with each other. And this can be developed and brought about through open protocols. Where, you know, safety and security, 2 words somehow speak for themselves. I mean, we need to make sure that drivers and industry as well have high levels of cybersecurity and data protection, but there's also the physical safety perspectives as well. So issues like fire safety are absolutely fundamental as well for our association. And we're very committed to working in partnership with other stakeholders. This means obviously the institutions such as the European Commission, European Parliament, and member state governments, and we'll say public bodies, but also other actors in the space. So the consumer associations, the automobile manufacturers, environmental NGOs. We really want to make this a kind of broad and open discussion so that we can end up with the best and the most comprehensive EV charging network and e-mobility network across the EU. That's a kind of a short overview of our goals. We have more, but they're the kind of, let's say, the core pillars, if we want to put it like that. And I think maybe briefly what I would like to just show is, because maybe some people, or a lot of people, it depends who drives an EV or doesn't drive an EV. So it's important to understand a little bit how the ecosystem works. And the best way to do that, as per our values, is to start from the driver. So on this slide, in the top left, or top left as I see it, is the EV driver. And the EV driver typically will sign a contract with a mobility service provider. And this mobility service provider should then allow the driver to have access and payment at charging stations. And the mobility service provider does this by having agreements with the charging point operator. And the charging point operator is the one who installs and manages the charging station. And so by having this agreement, the EV driver with the mobility service provider can drive up, stop at a charging station, and access and charge and pay. This can also be done, so this can be done with direct bilateral agreements with the mobility service provider and the charging point operator, or, for example, the mobility service provider can be connected to a roaming hub, which maybe has an aggregate of different charging point operators. But I suppose what is fundamental is the aim, and the aim is that we want to see a scenario where the EV driver signs up with one contract and can charge at different stations, no matter if it's offered by a different charging point operator. That's kind of the goal, should we say. There are many different actors, as we see. There's the service providers, the charging point operators, the charging station owners, for example, that could be a restaurant or a supermarket, and they will work with the charging point operator. obviously I can take questions on this obviously at the end, but I suppose that's just to give you an overview of the different actors involved. And importantly, we as ChargeUp Europe, our members are mobility service providers and charging point operators. And we also have hardware manufacturers as well, who aren't in this slide. But so that's a brief overview. The driver can also have, for publicly accessible charging infrastructure, ad hoc charging. And that means that you can drive up and charge and pay, we'll say, without having the contract with a mobility service provider. So there are different methods, different ways, but ultimately we want to make it as easy for the driver as possible to charge anywhere. And this is important because particularly as the market grows, we see many different use cases coming into play. It's perhaps many people often think of they think of electric vehicles at the moment, they think of the passenger car, but it's a growing market and it's a growing use cases that we see. So on this slide, I was going to show you kind of how it's developing very rapidly and what that means for charging and for us as ChargeUp Europe. Of course, we have the private cars, and this means, we'll say, you or me or whoever may be driving will want to charge at home overnight if it's parked. We'll want to charge at the office if you're there for 7-8 hours, hopefully not more, to charge during the day. Or if you maybe go to a restaurant or a hotel or something like this, we want to have these chargers there so that you can charge as you go. And they're different, of course. Maybe at home it's what we would classify as a private charger, but in a car park it might be fully publicly accessible or semi-public. And with this comes different requirements for us as charging point operators or service providers. We see really growing demand in the heavy duty vehicles, so trucks, lorries. We see that they are electrifying at an increasing rate, so it's going to be an increasingly important market segment for charging. And they often take long cross-border journeys where they need to charge regularly and charge fast. So on major routes and highways, we really need to see the development of infrastructure at this level, and also at their arrival and departure points, because they want to be fully charged before going, and then as when you arrive, maybe it's parked and you want to charge it up. Urban fleets and taxis and transport network companies, we also see growing demand in this sector, whether it's municipal buses or municipal heavy duty vehicles. There we would see the development of maybe charging hubs where they're often parked, so that they can get what they need before going out for the day to serve the public. And then with regard to taxis, we're looking, they're in very frequent use, so they're often on the go. They require fast charging, and then maybe the development of certain hubs at places where they may often be, whether it's train stations or airports, depending on the city. I mean, this is just to give you a flavor of how the market's developing, and it's much more than the private car, should we say. And so with this requires smart planning and thinking about where to deploy charging infrastructure and what type. If you're at home overnight, it might be an AC charger, which we'll classify maybe as a normal speed. But then maybe if you're on the go, particularly on highways, you need fast charging so that you don't stop for too long. That's a brief overview of who we are and kind of the ecosystem. And now I think what's important before we go into, I suppose, where we stand on policy topics, because it's closely linked, is our market forecasting and market development up to 2030. And this is something that we've just done recently with our knowledge partner, Arthur D. Little. Our key takeaway here is that it's fast growing, and we consider it certainly mainstream. It's not something we consider alternative as an alternative fuel. We think it's very much mainstream at this stage and will become even more so. So we've recently done analysis with our knowledge partner, Arthur D. Little, and we see that rapid growth is expected between now and 2030. And that's an important milestone, because in terms of EU policy, there's the aim to achieve a 55% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. And so with that, road transport as a key emitter of emissions will be important in terms of policy. So we see that, today we have maybe over 2 million electric vehicles on the road. That includes full battery electric vehicles, but also hybrids. Up to 2025, we see an 8-fold increase in that to 16 million, and then over 42 million by 2030. So you can see them from that kind of analysis, and this is based on vehicle sales forecasts from different sources. It's going to explode in some sense, if you want to put it like that. And we see a rapid growth. And you actually also see that battery electric vehicles by 2030 will be very, very much the predominant vehicle, with 77% of the share. So with that growth, that impacts charging, of course, no doubt about it. So we see that in terms of public charging, we will see an increase there. And why is this? Well, maybe today we might call early adopters of electric vehicles. They might have the charging infrastructure at home. They may be set up for that because, again, they're interested in it and that they've been one of the first movers. But as more and more people drive EVs, perhaps they may not have the possibility of home charging or work charging, depends, but we'll see the need for increase in public charging. So that share should grow from about 25% to 35%. And that will be a mix of AC, DC charging, and even more high-powered charging. But home charging will remain the most important use case. I'm just giving you these slides because it ties in very much in terms of what our policy position is and why we feel the need why there's such a strong need for robust and smart policy planning at the moment. Because if this is really to grow rapidly and develop evenly across the EU, it's vital that we have the policy and legislative frameworks in place that allow that to happen, that allow the market to grow, basically. Otherwise, it will be a missed opportunity. Because of this charging behavior and this increase in charging and vehicle numbers, we expect to see a high increase in terms of electricity demand. I won't spend too much time on this slide. It's just to show where we're going. So that by 2025, we expect about 10 terawatts of electricity demand for public charging. By 2030, we see that at 33 terawatts. And overall, by 2030, for all charging at home, private charging, or public charging, we're looking at 96. I show this slide because it ties into our kind of advocacy position for public policy, which we'll get to in a minute. So that's where we are at the moment and where we see things going. As I said, we see this kind of rapid growth, and without the right frameworks in place, this market won't grow properly. So it needs the right policy and the right legislative help, because the European Union is all about creating a single market and we'll say harmonized growth and development, hopefully across the Union. So to do this, we need to be smart about how we go about it. And in that regard, it's a critical moment for EU policy. And this ties very much into the European Union's Green Deal and its aim for, we'll say, climate neutrality by 2050. If we're talking about net zero emissions by 2050, that means decarbonizing almost every sector. And road transport is fundamental in that. Because road transport, I think, accounts for maybe over 70% of transport emissions. And transport itself is a key emitter. So it's a sector that really needs to be tackled. In terms of the road to 2050, the European Union wants to achieve a 55% emissions reduction target by 2030. It's only 10 years away. So the time to act is really, really now. It's fundamental that legislative policies are put in place that can enable these carbon emissions, because we do need those frameworks in place. It can't just be, let's say, the market alone that tries to achieve it, or other initiatives. You need the support so that this can happen evenly across the European Union. In this regard, a key upcoming policy package, should we say, from the European Union is a Fit for 55 package, it's called. And this is about achieving the 55% reduction by 2030. And within this package, it's going to review key transport legislation that will impact greatly the charging infrastructure sector. Because, particularly from our perspective, if you want to clean up the transport sector, the best way to do this is through electric mobility. So we really need the policies in place to allow this to happen. And this will happen through, and we've kind of broken it down here, 3 key policies from our perspective. There are others, but I'm just going to focus on 3 here for the moment, that tackle publicly accessible charging infrastructure, residential, non-residential, let's say private infrastructure, and then infrastructure on main routes. So highways, cross-border, things like this. And these are all going to, it's going to be proposals for this coming under this Fit for 55 package in the coming months. The first one is, and I'm probably killing you with acronyms here, but I won't go too into detail on that, the AFID, Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive. So this is a 2014 piece of legislation that essentially sets the legislative requirements for public charging across the EU. And that is being reviewed with a proposal to come from the Commission in 2 weeks, on the 14th of July. Then we have the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. For this, you can maybe read private charging at home, charging in the workplace. So that's we're kind of covering the public and the private there. And then the Trans-European Transport Networks, TEN-T. There we're looking at major routes, should we say, across the European Union. So these are key for us to kind of cover the three big segments of what is needed. And for each one, we have different policy positions, of course. But I mean, ultimately, what we're trying to do is create harmonized conditions for industry to roll out charging infrastructure across the European Union, and to do it in a way that works for member states and leads to kind of an even development across countries. And ultimately, you want, if you're serious about electric mobility and EV uptake, you need to be able to drive and charge across borders and at home, at work, in urban areas, and you need to cover the different segments. So to do this, you need to roll out infrastructure, and to make that happen, you need to have harmonized rules across the European Union, because you as an industry obviously need to know that there are certain requirements you need to meet, but that you don't have to change everything in each country, because if that happens, it's not a good incentive for investment and rollout. And also for the driver, you need to have some sort of common system so that you can kind of seamlessly charge anywhere, and it's not a whole new process every time. What I'd like to do is kind of focus on the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive for 1 or 2 slides, instead of trying to cover all these different policy areas. I mean, in each of these policy areas, we want to see a very strong focus on electric vehicle and e-mobility rollout. We want to see smart, we'll say, targets and requirements under these policy initiatives, because it can really incentivize the market and give, say, certainty for the long term. It can increase consumer acceptance and make access across borders much easier. And in light of this, and in light of the fact that, just here's a timeline of what's happening, that this proposal for the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive is coming in July, in 2 weeks. We last week came out with a very detailed position paper on what we would like to see in that. This is all to do with, obviously, publicly accessible charging infrastructure, and we want to see it developed in a smart way. We will be doing the same with TEN-T and EPBD in the coming months, but given the time sensitivity of the AFID proposal, I'll just focus on this for 1 or 2 slides, and it can give you a flavor of our positioning, basically, and what we'd like to see. Just to briefly recap, we see this with this rapid growth coming by 2025 and 2030 for the EV market. We see how this will impact on charging, particularly for public charging, and what that may mean for electricity demand. And this is important because this has impacted how we see and what we want to see in the legislation. And what we would like to see is the introduction of binding minimum capacity targets at member state level. Because some people are talking about, in this legislation, we want to see 3 million chargers rolled out without specifying how this should be done. Us as the charging sector, I suppose we know that this is not maybe the optimal route, because there are different types of chargers. There's AC charging, there is DC charging, there is high powered charging. They offer different speeds, that means different capacity requirements. And what's important is that, you know, we don't just have numbers for numbers' sake, but we take a capacity approach that will say gives you a certain level that needs to be reached, but that it can then be decided and well planned about what type of charging is needed where. Because if we just have a number that says X amount of chargers by 2025 or 2030, they may all be a certain type of charger that doesn't work. It may not be fast enough. It may not work at a specific location. So it needs to be well planned. And that's our point. So we see the need for, based on these market forecasts and charging behavior development, 29,000 megawatts by 2025, absolute minimum, that's the minimum, and 66,000 megawatts by 2030. Indicatively, how could this look? Because we did the analysis with our knowledge partner, Arthur D. Little. You could see this as, by 2025, resulting in about 1.1 million publicly accessible charging points. For example, 900,000 AC, 200,000 DC, 40,000 high-powered charging points. Now, these are just indicative. This is not something that we're saying this should be the exact number. And then we see the same similar for 2030, about potential indicative splits of how that 66,000 megawatts could be installed to serve the passenger fleet. We think that these targets, that's a very important point. That's the overall EU target. This should be broken down by member state level so that we can have those targets at member state level according to where they are now. So there may be some countries that are, we'll say, more mature in where they are in terms of the EV market, and there may be others who are just starting out or beginning. So obviously you can't give them the same target. So it's very important that these targets at member state level are developed according to robust market projections and analysis of where the starting point is. So, how many EVs are in a certain member state at the moment? What is the geographical nature of the member state? What's the population? Is there more urban density or rural density? Is there more of a, let's say, way of living in houses or apartment buildings? All this kind of thing changes. How well connected it is. So based on this and based on this kind of robust analysis, you can then develop the targets for those member states, capacity-wise. And once you have the capacity, maybe you see what type of charging points should be rolled out. This is key for us. We think these targets should be introduced in the revision of the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive. But targets for target's sake don't make sense, because you can't just say, reach this number. I don't care how you do it, just make it happen. It needs to be supported with really smart policy. And the first point we'd like to see in this regard is, as I think I've already said, it needs to be grounded in robust projections for the development of the market and situations, but it needs to be supported with the regulation. That's our view. The current legislation is a directive that allows for more flexibility in implementation at member state level. And what we've seen from the original directive, 2014, is that it wasn't implemented well and has led to fragmentation basically across member states. So you have different hardware requirements, different technical requirements in some member states. They have developed national frameworks that maybe weren't ambitious enough or enforced. So you've seen this really uneven development across the union. And we think a regulation with its more, we'll say, direct approach in terms of how it should be implemented is the way to go, because we need a harmonized market. Without it, it's going to lead to more uneven development, make it much more difficult for companies to roll out infrastructure, and make it harder for the driver, because there will be different different setups in different member states, so it won't make sense. To achieve, I think, this as well, it's important that member states come up with charging action plans, and this is kind of ties into our need for a smart approach. So this should be developed in according to what's our starting point as a member state? How can we incentivize citizens to take up EVs? How can we help them install chargers at home? How can we help industry connect to the grid quicker? Because sometimes it can be very difficult, or the processes for once you put in the request for a charging station to actually get it approved and set up can take a long time and be a bit opaque. So that needs to be improved. And there are other points related to the technical requirements and metering requirements that are different across different countries. So it's very hard to develop such a single market then. This is the point, as you've seen from our market forecast, things are really exploding and expanding rapidly, so it needs to be supported. And we need a kind of consistent approach across the EU. We have one other slide that kind of shows we have many other recommendations for what needs to be done. For example, and we quite like this one, we call for the introduction of a right to plug, so that people can request the installation of charging points at home or near their residence or workplace, because currently it can be very difficult to do so, if not impossible in some places. So there are things like that to make it easier for the driver. We want to see improved transparency and governance for approval of charging installation. We want to see member states develop action plans for fast charging and key points related to interoperability and roaming, so that for publicly accessible charging infrastructure, there are certain requirements that need to be met that make it easier for drivers to drive and charge at different stations, basically. I won't go into all of these now. Could share the slides after, of course, but I think the key takeaway, I suppose, from us, ChargeUp Europe, as an industry association with a European perspective, is that what we see in the market, where we see it going, and if we're serious about meeting the EU's Green Deal aims, then we need strong, robust policy that incentivizes market development and delivers for the driver, for public charging, for private charging, and cross-border as well. So we really need this kind of, we'll say, coherent approach to develop and deliver for electric mobility. And I think that is my last slide.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, George. So there's already a couple of questions in the chat. So maybe just to remind the public and the audience, if you have any questions, if you have anything you would like to know and always wanted to ask, please go ahead. We have about 10 minutes left to discuss those questions. So maybe let me start with a question that is maybe addressing one of your slides. You had said that there's a certain number that you expect to be there of electric vehicles to meet the Fit for 55 targets. And there's someone who says that they were expecting a much higher share than you suggested for 2035. So the question is, will this be enough to satisfy the Fit for 55 targets?
They said they mentioned vehicles by 2030 or 2035.
35.
30. So my reference was 2030. It was 42 million. But actually, by 2035, we actually expect. I can actually show the slide here. Maybe 1 second. It's over 80 million. So that might answer that question potentially. So that's even double, basically double what we have. By 2035, we expect to see a lot more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying this. Then there's a question with regards to standardization. So you had already also said that there's different kinds of charging stations. And this person addresses the fact that there's very different charging speeds all around the EU. So there's, for example, in Eastern Europe, they say it's 75 kilowatts. That is already extremely high, but then elsewhere it's more than third of this. Do you expect, or would you aim for a standardization?
I don't. I think this maybe comes back to our point on why we need the approach at different member state levels, because, and that's a very good point. So we see in some countries the starting point may be very different from others. So I don't think it would be a standardization per se, but an approach that that works for the member state. So different charging speeds in different areas. But I think for us, it's also very important about where the charger is. So if it's on a highway or a main route, for example, it should likely be a faster charger. But if it's at home, the charging speed, of course, maybe more normal, should we say, because it's charging overnight. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, ultimately, you want to see the rollout of the best and most efficient charging speeds wherever. But I think what we would see that happening through the market itself. Phrase sometimes we use, like, the market will hopefully take care of that, but by creating the frameworks so that it can incentivize investment, we can see that, or we believe that the charging infrastructure and charging speeds, for example, will be placed where it makes most sense, because otherwise it wouldn't make, I suppose, good business sense to install a charger that nobody can use. So we see it kind of developing like that.
Okay. But how would these different systems and different charging speeds then communicate? So if someone's traveling elsewhere in another EU country and is experiencing different charging speeds, how would that communicate?
Well, I think that's no problem. I mean, that's no problem at all, because I mean the vehicle should be able to, the vehicle can charge at different speeds, should we say. So I don't think there's an issue with that. Now, with regard to the communication, for example, between maybe the mobility, the service and the charging point operator or something like this, we want to see the creation of an open ecosystem where they can and will communicate with each other. Particularly this is for publicly accessible charging infrastructure. So this is a very important point, that we want to see open protocols and standards such as, I won't go in, OCPP and OCPI, basically, they're kind of de facto standards at the moment that allow this to happen, basically. So that's the key point with it. It's something we work towards.
Okay. And there's another question addressing the energy that you put into your batteries. This person addresses the fact that, choosing an electric vehicle is considered to be a good thing for the environment, but only if there's green energy going into it. Is there any way, any idea how you could control this on your side?
Well, it's something we're looking into as well, is renewables. I didn't go into it today, but absolutely the use of renewables, we'll say, in the overall ecosystem is key. So yeah, the integration of renewables into the electricity system is fundamental, but it's interesting because sometimes the point gets brought up where people will say, is e-mobility actually cleaner than we'll say the typical internal combustion engine? And it's Transport Environment, the NGO, have a very nice tool that exists where you can see just how much less the emissions are from e-mobility than a traditional ICE vehicle. But the renewables point is something we are working on, and yes, we actually last week published a joint letter about why it's so important to have a focus on e-mobility in renewables legislation.
There's another question coming in. I was just reading it.
Okay, no problem.
It's rather a remark. They're saying, how important is it to build the first truck charging infrastructure now to establish the trust of the trucking companies?
Well, I think it is happening, and you actually see some companies electrifying already. I think it's. I hope I'm not wrong here, but I think it's correct. I think Volvo were electrifying some of their trucking fleet recently with one of our members. Kind of that an announcement. So it's happening, but what's very important is that. And not to repeat myself, but that the right frameworks are in place that allow the rollout of this infrastructure. Because definitely, obviously, everybody needs to have the signs that it's happening and that it's possible, because you need to make your investment decisions. But yes, the construction and rollout is key.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.